You've heard the good news, bad news kind of jokes. Well, I'm going to talk about a bad news, good news kind of thing, but it's no joke. We talked about God's creation and how he declared it all very good, and about how the humans were made in his image as representatives over all of his very good creation. But because he's the creator and he's the authority over his creation, he had made the human beings accountable to him by giving them a command. And at some point after that very good creation, the human beings, the woman and then the man, had stepped outside God's boundary. That's called sin, when you go your own way instead of God's way. And what had been a perfect creation immediately experienced devastation, a cosmic catastrophe, as the consequences of sin spread throughout all of creation. When human beings went their own way instead of God's way, it was very bad news. The penalty of death took place on two different levels. You see, death is separation. And the very first thing that happened was separation from God. Human beings were created to be in intimate personal relationship with God. We were made to have fellowship with him and with each other. And that very first moment that sin came in, we were separated from God. And then, of course, physical death, the separation of our spiritual continuing part of us, would eventually be separated from our physical part, and physical death would ensue. But as soon as sin came into God's very good creation, he made a promise that one day he would take steps to reverse the consequence of sin and death that occurred that day as a result of the human's choice to step outside God's boundary. The day sin came in to God's very good creation, he promised that he would send someone that he referred to as the seed of a woman who would reverse the consequence of sin and death. Now we see that promise in Genesis chapter 3. This is how God worded it. He said that one day a seed of a woman would crush the head of the serpent, and at that point, his heel would be bruised. This is the first preaching of the gospel. The word gospel, when translated from the Greek, means good news. The bad news was we were separated from God, whom we were created to be in relationship with, and it was our very own choice through sin that separated us from him. But the good news was that God was going to send someone called the seed of a woman who would restore our relationship with God. This was God's plan. This was God's promise. And that's the good news that we find in the message of Jesus Christ. So in the Old Testament, it's filled with the prophecies and the promises that God made through history as he moved through the lives of real people like you and me, whom he used to fulfill this promise as he took people and their lives and used them to create events in history and moments in time where this person, the seed of the woman, Jesus Christ, born of a virgin, the seed of a woman, who would one day pay the penalty for each one of our personal sins through his death on the cross. When Jesus came, he spoke about his own death as the means through which the sin debt of each individual would be paid. We're going to look at that in some depth later on. But right now, we just want to look at a few things that he said in the New Testament gospel of the book of John. It's in John where Jesus tells us the very most about himself. And in the book of John, in chapter 5, as he's speaking to a very large crowd, Jesus tells this crowd that if they believe in him, who he claims to be, that they could pass from death, that separation from God, not just physical death, but spiritual death. If they believe in him, they can pass from death into life, that restored relationship with God, which is eternal life. Later on, he explained how that would happen. He said that he was the good shepherd, and that the good shepherd would lay down his life for the sheep. Now, this was a familiar picture to the people of the New Testament era because shepherds were all around them, and it was the shepherd's job to care for the sheep. And so in this everyday picture of a shepherd caring for the sheep, they could relate to that. But then he went a little bit further and he said, I lay down my life for the sheep only to take it up again. I lay down my life for the sheep and I take it up again. Now, Jesus was talking about his death through crucifixion and the resurrection that would follow. His death would pay the penalty of sin on our behalf, and the resurrection would be the evidence that the penalty was paid. That indeed is good news. God's promise, made so long ago in the garden, would be fulfilled through the death and the resurrection of the Good Shepherd, the person Jesus Christ, whom he would send, born of a virgin, the seed of a woman, who is God's own Son. Now, in order to understand how this all works, we have to understand that Jesus is not just an ordinary man, although he was fully man. Jesus was God the Son and a human being. We'll talk more about that further in later episodes. But if you have time, can I encourage you to read the book of John? You may discover things about Jesus you never really understood before.